If you're under 40, you've probably had the experience. You're scrolling through a real estate app just for fun, and you see it. A tiny, crumbling house, miles from anywhere you'd want to live, listed for a price that would have been a king's ransom just a generation ago. You close the app. The game feels rigged. Your parents and grandparents tell stories of buying their first home on a single, modest income. It wasn't a luxury. It was the foundation of a middle-class life. This is why today's housing market feels like a broken promise. The data confirms the feeling. In 1970, the median American home cost about 3 times the median annual income. Today, that number is over 7, and in major cities, it's well into the double digits. You're working harder, you're more productive, but the single most important pillar of financial stability is sprinting away from you. What happened? What force is powerful enough to warp the very fabric of the American dream? The common answers are a blizzard of complexity. Zoning laws, foreign investors, low inventory, corporate landlords. And while all those things play a part, they are symptoms of a much deeper cause. They are aftershocks from a single, seismic event. To understand why you can't afford a house, you don't need to start with city council meetings or Wall Street trading desks. You need to start with a secret meeting held over a single weekend in August of 1971. This is our thesis. President Richard Nixon's decision on August 15, 1971, to sever the US dollar from its last link to gold, created a global fiat currency system that fundamentally transformed the home from shelter into a financial asset. It was a calculated political move, made under immense pressure, that had a world-altering and deeply personal consequences. Because of this decision, the very nature of money changed. It unleashed a machine of unrestrained credit creation that has run for over 50 years. This new system allowed debt to expand faster than the real economy, and asset prices, like houses, to systematically outpace the wages of the people who live in them. Your home became a speculative commodity on a global casino table, and your paycheck could no longer keep up with the bets. This is the story of that decision. We will trace the line from a crisis in the White House to the crisis at your kitchen table. We will show how a president's choice, made to solve a short-term political problem, set in motion the very long-term financial reality you're trapped in today. To understand the earthquake of 1971, you first have to understand the world it shattered. After the devastation of World War II, global leaders gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They were haunted by the economic chaos, the hyperinflation and depressions that had fueled the rise of fascism. Their goal was to build a system that would prevent it from ever happening again. Their solution was a calculated trade. They would sacrifice a degree of national freedom for global stability. The system they designed, known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, was an elegant hierarchy. At its foundation was gold. The US dollar was then pegged directly to that gold, at a fixed price of $35 an ounce. Every other major currency, from the British pound to the Japanese yen, was then pegged to the US dollar. This made the dollar the undisputed king of global finance. But it was a king in chains. Any foreign country holding dollars could, at any time, show up at the US Treasury and demand physical gold in return. This is why the system was often called a Golden Straitjacket. It placed a hard, physical limit on the amount of money a government could create. American politicians couldn't just fire up the printing presses to fund a new program or a foreign war. Every dollar sent out into the world had to be backed by a corresponding amount of gold sitting in a vault at Fort Knox. It was a system built on discipline, designed to prevent the very kind of runaway inflation that had torn Europe apart. Because of this discipline, the nature of a home was fundamentally different. Money was anchored to something real, something finite. This kept long-term credit creation and inflation on a tight leash. A house was, first and foremost, a place to live. It was a durable good, a form of shelter, not a high-flying financial instrument. Its value was tethered to local wages and building costs. But that stability came at a price. The straitjacket was tight, and by the late 1960s, a convergence of domestic spending and foreign conflict would make that price one that President Nixon was no longer willing to pay. That tight straitjacket of gold was about to be torn apart by two of the most powerful forces in politics: war and ambition. The 1960s saw President Lyndon B. Johnson try to have it all. He launched his Great Society, a sweeping set of domestic programs to fight poverty and injustice. This was the butter. At the very same time, he escalated a catastrophic war in Vietnam. This was the guns. To pay for both, Johnson and his successor, Richard Nixon, did what the gold standard was designed to prevent: They created money out of thin air. This is why the global financial system started to crack. The US Treasury was printing billions of dollars and shipping them overseas to fund military bases, foreign aid, and its growing trade deficit. The problem was simple. America was writing checks its gold reserves couldn't cash. Foreign countries, particularly in Europe, began to accumulate massive piles of US dollars. They looked at the vaults in Fort Knox, did the math, and realized the bluff. There were now far more dollars in the world than there was gold to back them up at the promised rate of $35 an ounce. And then, one man decided to call that bluff. His name was Charles de Gaulle, the fiercely proud and deeply skeptical president of France. De Gaulle viewed the dollar's dominance not as a gift to the world, but as America's exorbitant privilege. It allowed the US to buy up European companies and fund foreign wars with money it could create at will. He saw this as a direct threat to French sovereignty. So in 1971, de Gaulle made a calculated, theatrical move. He sent a French warship across the Atlantic to the New York harbor with a simple instruction: exchange France's paper dollars for America's physical gold. This wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a geopolitical challenge. It was a battleship pulling up to a bank to make a withdrawal. The message was clear. The world was losing faith in the dollar. For President Nixon, the crisis was no longer theoretical. The Golden Straitjacket was strangling him, and the French were pulling it tighter. Friday, August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon gathered his top economic advisors for a secret meeting at the presidential retreat, Camp David. The public was told it was a routine budget discussion. The truth was far more consequential. The global monetary system was on the verge of collapse, and Nixon knew he had to act before the markets opened on Monday. The French had demanded gold, the British were next in line, and the dollar was hemorrhaging value. In the room were 15 of the most powerful men in the country. Two voices mattered most. There was Paul Volcker, a towering, cigar-chomping monetary traditionalist. He represented the old guard, arguing that the U.S. had to honor its promise. To him, breaking the link to gold was unthinkable. It would shatter global trust. But opposing him was the formidable John Connally, Nixon's Treasury Secretary. A sharp-tongued Texan politician, Connally cared less about economic theory and more about raw power. He saw the gold standard not as a source of stability, but as a chain holding America back. Nixon was trapped. His political instincts told him that raising taxes or slashing spending to defend the dollar would guarantee his defeat in the upcoming 1972 election. Devaluing the dollar, admitting it was worth less, felt like a national humiliation. Connally offered a third, more audacious path. Don't play the game, he argued, change the rules. He urged Nixon to unilaterally close the gold window, to slam the door shut and flatly refuse to redeem any more dollars for gold. It was a shocking proposal. For 27 years, the world's economy had been built on America's promise. Connally was telling Nixon to break it. The debate raged through the weekend. Finally, Nixon, the ultimate political survivor, made his choice. He sided with Connally. On Sunday night, August 15th, he went on national television and announced a series of new economic policies. Buried among wage and price controls was the bombshell. He was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. But everyone knew it wasn't temporary. In a single weekend, with a single decision, Nixon had smashed the Golden Straitjacket. He had severed the last link between money and anything physical or finite. This act, born of political desperation, is what would ultimately transform the American home. Because once money was untethered from reality, the price of everything else could become untethered too. The world woke up on August 16, 1971, to a financial earthquake. For a generation, global economies had meticulously pegged their currencies to the US dollar, believing it was a stable, reliable anchor, a direct claim on American gold. Nixon's announcement vaporized that promise overnight. The anchor was gone. Panic erupted in currency markets from Tokyo to London. This is where the raw strategic calculation behind the decision becomes clear. At a meeting with European finance ministers, shocked by America's unilateral move, Treasury Secretary John Connally was asked what the U.S. planned to do. His response was a blunt display of geopolitical power. He famously declared that the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. Because of this stance, The rest of the world was left holding trillions of US dollars that could no longer be redeemed for gold. They had played by the rules, and America had just flipped the table over. The old system of fixed exchange rates was dead. In its place, a chaotic new one emerged. Floating exchange rates. For the first time, the world's major currencies would float freely, their values determined daily by supply and demand, like stocks. This strategic maneuver shifted the burden of America's spending problems onto everyone else, cementing the dollar's dominance not through a promise of gold, but through sheer necessity. The world had no choice but to keep using it. Connolly's power play solved America's immediate political problem, but its long-term consequences would reshape the very nature of money. This led directly to the birth of the modern financial system. With the dollar no longer a claim check for a physical object in a vault, it became what's known as a fiat currency. The word fiat is Latin for "let it be done." Money that exists simply because a government declares it has value. Its only backing is trust in that government. The removal of the Golden Straitjacket was like taking the governor off an engine. Under the gold standard, the amount of money and credit in the system was physically limited by the amount of gold in the Treasury's vaults. It was a hard, physical break on government spending and bank lending. But in the new age of fiat, that break was gone. This is why the financial world was permanently altered. For the first time in modern history, there was no theoretical limit to the amount of money that could be created. The US government, working with the central bank, could now create dollars with a keystroke. This unleashed the credit creation machine on an unprecedented scale. Debt, once constrained by physical reality, was now a purely abstract tool. Governments could finance deficits that would have been unimaginable just years earlier. Banks, no longer needing to worry about customers demanding gold, could expand their lending dramatically. An ocean of new money and credit was about to flood the global economy, and that flood had to go somewhere. It would soon begin seeking a return, not just in factories and wages, but in assets, stocks, bonds, and most critically for our story, the house next door. This new age of fiat currency created an immediate and dangerous problem. With the dollar no longer convertible to gold, why would any foreign country want to hold it? The dollar was now just a piece of paper, backed by a promise that the US government had just publicly broken. The entire global system was at risk of losing faith in America's currency, which could have triggered a catastrophic collapse in its value. US policymakers, led by strategic minds like Henry Kissinger, knew they needed to find a new anchor for the dollar, and fast. If gold was no longer the foundation, they needed to make the dollar essential for something else, something the entire world had to buy. The answer was oil. This led to one of the most consequential and least understood economic arrangements of the 20th century, the petrodollar system. Through a series of quiet agreements in the early 1970s, the US forged a strategic pact with Saudi Arabia, the world's dominant oil producer. The deal was brutally effective in its simplicity. The US would provide military aid and protection. In exchange, the Saudis would price all of their oil sales to every country in the world, exclusively in US dollars. Soon, the rest of OPEC, the cartel of oil-exporting nations, followed suit. Because of this, any country that needed to buy oil now first had to buy US dollars. Think of it like a global gas station that only accepts one company's gift cards. Suddenly, everyone needs those gift cards. This masterstroke created a massive, permanent, and artificial global demand for American currency. It was the dollar's second act. It was no longer backed by gold, it was now backed by oil. This is why the US could run enormous deficits and print money without facing immediate consequences. The world was forced to absorb those new dollars to keep their economies running. With the dollar's global dominance secured, the credit creation machine, unleashed in 1971, could now run at full throttle. An unprecedented flood of new money poured into the economy. But here's the critical question. Where did it all go? Why didn't this torrent of new currency lead to a golden age of rising wages for everyone? The answer is that the money followed the path of least resistance, flowing not into the pockets of workers, but into the balance sheets of assets. This is because the new system fundamentally changed the incentives for banks. Lending money to build a new factory or fund a startup is risky and complicated. But lending money against a pre-existing finite asset, like a piece of land or a house, is simple and perceived as safe. The house itself acts as collateral. This created what we now call the Great Divergence. Imagine two charts after 1971. One shows the median worker's wages, the other shows the price of assets, like stocks and, most importantly, housing. For decades, those two lines moved together, but after the gold standard was severed, they split apart. And the gap has been widening ever since. The new money inflated the value of things we own far faster than the value of the work we do. Wages became disconnected from the cost of the assets that signify a middle-class life. This is the direct result of turning money from a hard commodity into an abstract financial tool. The house next door was no longer just a place to live. It was becoming a financial instrument, a sponge soaking up this new ocean of credit. And that's why, year after year, the price tag on that house began to pull away, leaving the average paycheck far, far behind. So we followed the breadcrumbs from a secret meeting at Camp David in 1971 all the way to the front door of a house you can't afford today. We've seen how Richard Nixon, desperate to win an election, severed the dollar from gold. We saw how that decision unleashed a global system of fiat money, and how Paul Volcker's calculated strategy locked that system in place, making the US dollar the world's undisputed reserve currency. And we saw how this new system created the Great Divergence, where the value of assets, like houses, shot to the moon, leaving wages stuck on the launch pad. This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. It's the hidden mechanism that makes this whole situation feel so crazy, so fundamentally unfair. It's called the bifurcation of inflation, a fancy term for a simple idea. After 1971, inflation split into two different rivers. The first river is the one everyone talks about, consumer price inflation, or the CPI. This is the price of your gas, your groceries, your movie tickets. For the last few decades, central banks have been very effective at keeping this number low and stable, usually around 2%. When you hear a politician or a news anchor say, inflation is under control, this is the river they're looking at. But the torrent of new money created since 1971 had to go somewhere. It flowed into the second times river, asset price inflation. This is the price of stocks, bonds, and most importantly, housing. Because the new system makes it easy and profitable for banks to lend against assets, this river became a raging, out-of-control flood. This is the core of the problem. You are forced to earn your money in the slow-moving river of consumer wages, but you have to buy your biggest asset, a home, in the raging flood of asset inflation. The system is designed to make the value of what you own rise exponentially faster than the value of what you do. Because of this, your house is not a home anymore, in the way it was for your grandparents. It's no longer just shelter. It has been transformed into a financial instrument. It's a retirement plan, a speculative investment, and a primary storage vehicle for wealth created by this massive 50-year expansion of credit. You aren't just competing with other families for a place to live. You're competing with global capital, with investment funds, and with a banking system that is incentivized to push prices ever higher. The game feels rigged because the rules were quietly rewritten in 1971. You're playing a different game than your parents, with a currency that works in a fundamentally different way. The decision Nixon made wasn't about housing. It was a strategic move in a high-stakes game of geopolitical power. But its longest-lasting consequence is the front door you can no longer afford to walk through. If you found this history eye-opening, hit subscribe for more deep dives that connect the past to your present, and leave a comment below. What's the biggest barrier to homeownership you see in your community?